welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby. Hey guys, we are glad that you are with us for another episode of the MessianTics Podcast with Rabbis David, Eric, Toby, and Jonathan as we move into a fresh new episode. And by fresh, we mean we're going to rehash the conversation that we had last week and did not get to finish. And I'm pretty sure we'll never actually finish because it's just such a great conversation. But we're gonna come back around and continue that conversation, dealing with the idea of the one new man and Jew and Gentile together in the body of Messiah. So with that said, let's dive into it, guys.
Yeah, this is episode 3, and for the record, we're circling back.
Yes.
To a conversation 6,000 years in the making.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So yeah, one of the things we were talking about last week in this idea of Jew and Gentile, and we talked about it a little more after the show, but we never really got a chance to deal with it in the podcast itself, is we wanted to touch on two passages in Acts that are a big part of this conversation, and it's really one of those things that when we're debating scriptural issues in the body of Messiah, often we're arguing two different points, but we're using the exact same scripture for it, as opposed to recognizing that both can be right and wrong at the same time. Both positions can have a little bit of positive, a little bit of negative, and we got to find that happy medium that the scripture's actually talking about. But one of those passages is Acts 10, and then the other is Acts 15. And so we really wanted to dive into this and have a conversation on these two passages, on what the text is really saying and what it's referring to, and who in particular it is especially for, and how to understand that, live it out, and dive into it.
Right. It's important to remember that when we're reading the text of the Bible, we have to determine who it's written to, because, for instance, in the Brit, Tokajer, the New Covenant, the text is written to one of four groups, or all four of them, or a group of them. In other words, you have Jewish non-believers, Jewish believers, non-Jewish non-believers, and non-Jewish believers. And so in order to determine how we apply something, we have to look and say, okay, who is this written to? And is this written directly to a group of people, or is this written to everybody? So, for instance, in Romans 2, we know it's written to Jewish people because it says, if you being a Jew. So when we look at that and we see down where it says a true Jew or a real Jew is one who's circumcised of the heart, it's not telling Gentiles that if they become believers, they become Jews. It's talking to Jewish people and saying, if you as a Jew want to actually be a praiser of God, a leader, a director, and lead non-Jewish people to faith in Messiah, you have to have your heart circumcised, like Deuteronomy says. So when we look at these verses, we have to decide who is this written to, and then decide how it applies to me or someone else based upon that.
Yeah, and I think that's the concept growing up in the Messianic movement, the thing we used to hear all the time, and you don't hear people say it as much anymore for whatever reason, but the thing we used to hear people say all the time is you would say you were a Messianic Jew, and they would say, oh, you're Jews for Jesus. Well, no, I mean, we're believers, we believe in Jesus, we're all Messianic, and by the way, I don't know that we're ever going to find unity in the Messianic movement. This has nothing to do with our topic. I don't know that we're ever actually going to see unity in the movement until Messianic Judaism as a whole can stop trying to correct people when they say, oh, you're like Jews for Jesus. Yeah, we are. I mean, we may have different approaches to how we do things, but yes, we are Jews for Jesus. We believe in Jesus as the Messiah. They are Messianic. We are Messianic. We're part of the same community, and we end up like fighting amongst each other for no real reason at all to try and correct language. But we used to always hear people say, as a Messianic Jew, what I am is a completed Jew. And I think that's really kind of Paul's idea there in Romans 2, is he's saying, look, in order to be Jewish, it's not just that you were circumcised. It's not just that you're born of Abraham. It's not just that. It's that you found your promised Jewish Messiah and have found the fullness of Jewish faith,
right, and complete,
in the Jewish Messiah.
Not in the sense of incomplete. Like Jewish people who don't believe in Yeshua yet are not incomplete humans.
Correct.
Or incomplete Jews. They just don't believe in the fullness of the New Testament, which is the completion of the narrative or the story.
Yep.
Yeah, it's funny. It used to be, like you said, people would say, what are you? I'd say, I'm a Messianic Jew. And they'd go, oh. And then I'd say, oh, are you familiar with that? No. I have no idea what that is. But they'd say, oh, as if they, just The other part was, oh, you're Jews for Jesus, and then you'd spend an hour saying, no, Jews for Jesus is a missionary organization that does this, and not all Messianic Jews are part of Jews for Jesus, but Jews for Jesus are Messianic Jews, and go through this whole thing where we're, like you said, defining ourselves by what we're not rather than what we are.
Yeah.
I think another thing that would help unity in the Messianic movement, I fully agree with that. I think another thing is, because since we're on the subject of the one new man, is the Messianic movement has got to find a healthy way across the board, because I think it's healthy in areas. I think it's healthy depending on what congregation you're at. I think it depends on that. But the Messianic movement's got to find a healthy way to make non-Jewish believers that are called to the Messianic movement 100%, like Ruth, to not feel like second-class citizens, because I felt that way for years. God delivered me from it. I mean, God had to deliver me from it. But what makes me sad is I run into younger people or people who've not been in the movement as long as me, and I get, oh, I feel that way sometimes, or you know what, I still feel that way, and I'm like, that is a problem.
Yeah.
That is a problem. We've got to find a healthy way to address that, instead of focusing on, because we were at, I've once heard it said, I was hearing statistics. I was at a teaching, at Messianic teaching, and I heard things like, well, we had, there's a problem with, we have non-Jewish people in the movement saying that they're Jews. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a problem. I agree that that's a problem.
Yeah.
It's also a problem that you have non-Jewish believers in the movement that feel like second-class citizens. And I think those two issues are connected. Them calling themselves Jews and then also feeling like they're second place.
Yeah.
Because there's no second-class citizens in God's kingdom. But here's what's interesting and what I'd like to kind of put forth in the discussion. The one thing I've realized as someone who grew up 25 years in the church, the one issue that the church doesn't have, that the Messianic movement has, is this issue of non-Jews, this ethnic issue of non-Jews feeling second class. And in the church, that I never struggle with that.
Now I can tell you, though, from my experience, when I became a believer in Yeshua in a church, I was almost elevated. Like, people believed I had a matrix download of the Old Testament, and that if they came to me, and I was a brand new believer, and I wasn't that so strong in my faith that I wouldn't lie. So people would come to me, and I'd just give an answer, because I didn't want to act as if I didn't know anything, and I was too immature as a believer. So they'd say, well, what do you think this means? And so I just, the rabbis say that, or, just whatever. And because I was elevated to the point where they were asking me to teach and speak and stuff, and I knew nothing about the New Testament. And so there was that in my experience in it. But the reality is, we need to get, as you said, past this division to understand that there's no position higher in the kingdom than Son of God.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, you are a child of the King. You are a son of God. And so if we get to that place where we understand that, we don't argue so much male-female or employer-employee, but for some reason we argue Jew-non-Jew.
Yeah. Yes.
And we shouldn't have that. There are distinctions. I mean, every one of our synagogues have one room with 5 letters and one room with 3 letters. There's a ladies' room and a men's room, a woman's room and a men's room. We don't argue about who's saved or unsaved, or who in the community as a female congregant has responsibilities to this as far as walking out with the Lord. But for some reason, we have this big debate about Jew and non-Jew, as if a non-Jewish person does something like wearing a kippah or wearing a talit, that it's going to somehow un-Jew the Jews,
right?
To the point where there's not a distinction, and there is a distinction if the people are taught healthily and properly that as a non-Jewish person, you don't become Jewish when you become a follower of Yeshua.
So let me ask this question, because I mean, and I promise we're getting Acts 10 and 15, and this all feeds right into it. But here's, I think it's important as we have this conversation, especially the part of the nameplay, the wordplay in the name of this podcast is MessianTics. So it's Messianics and the antics of Messianic Judaism, right? And so I want to pose this question because I think it's a really important discussion to have when we're looking at, for instance, you talked about it's important for unity in the movement if we stop doing things that make Gentiles feel second class, right, Toby? And
yes.
But here's the question I have is how much of the feeling like we're second class, like if a person in the Messianic synagogue that's not Jewish, how much of that is something that's actually being imposed upon them, and how much of that is a identity problem, identity crisis they're having themselves? And I ask this because on the other side of the conversation, and I know that there are, and I won't name names because it really doesn't matter, but I know there are congregations, Messianic synagogues, that intentionally are a little less welcoming to Gentiles. And, that is what it is. That's between them and God and how they do things. Our congregations are not that way. But I've had people, as a Messianic rabbi, I've had people in our congregations, and this one guy in particular, when we were in Georgia, that would come up to me, it seemed like almost every week, and he was like, he felt like God called him to Messianic Judaism, but it was this constant battle trying to find a way that maybe he had some loophole access to being Jewish so that he could have a reason for being there. And he came to me one week, he goes, Rabbi, we'd already had this conversation 3 or 4 times about different things. He goes, Rabbi, I just saw this article that said the Cherokee Indians may actually be Jewish, that they were originally one of the tribes of Israel and they somehow got over. What do you think? Are the Cherokee Indians really Jewish? And if so, I'm like 3/32 Cherokee. Does that mean I'm actually Jewish? And I stopped him. I was like, dude, hang on. He goes, what? I said, I got to ask you, man, like, what difference does it make? He's like, huh? I said, do you feel called to Messianic Judaism? Yes. Are your grandparents Jewish? Can you prove that one of your 4 grandparents is Jewish? No. Can you prove one of your parents is Jewish? Well, not really. So what difference does it make? Like, you were called into this having no connection to Judaism, but God called you to Messianic Judaism. You're trying to justify God's calling as opposed to walking freely as a Messianic believer who happens to be non-Jewish in the Messianic Jewish community. Walk out God's calling and your identity in that calling. And right. So, yes, there are absolutely congregations and rabbis in the movement that do, in fact, make Gentiles feel less than, and I get that. But I don't know that I would say that that's like an across-the-board thing. And so I'm curious, I feel like, at least personally, I feel like I've always experienced, or maybe only experienced on this subject, healthy congregations in terms of interaction between Jew and Gentile. So I've never been in an environment where I felt like something that was being done would cause that feeling to non-Jews, and I recognize that there are non-Jews that have that feeling. I'm not like belittling that feeling, but being 2 Jews and 2 Gentiles, I think it'd be kind of interesting. Let's hash this conversation out. I mean, do you think how much of that is actually imposed and how much of that is identity crisis fed into it?
I think that some of it we do to ourselves in the way, for instance, on our visitors packet, there's a line on the card they fill out. Are you Jewish or are you non-Jewish? I know the reason for that is because when you're ministering to Jewish people, you come from one direction. When you're ministering to non-Jewish people, trying to share Messiah and trying to lead them to a redemptive experience, you start in different places. But I know that if I were somebody coming to the congregation and I looked at it, why does he want to know if I'm Jewish or non-Jewish? Why? Because when you go to the local conservative or reform synagogue and you fill out the thing, you're generally not going to see Jewish. Nobody comes up and says, "So are you Jewish? Are you Jewish?"
I don't put that on my card or my membership application, but that's a conversation we can have one-on-one, and I feel like it's a more healthy way to do it.
Right, but it is something that when somebody gets our greeting materials, that it's a line item.
I can see that, yeah.
I just, for me, I'm more than willing to admit that who's struggled for years with insecurity and my own self-image and my own value in God's eyes, my perceived value in God's eyes, which has been, not healthy. I'm more than willing to admit that it's definitely because of that's part of it. But the other part of it is hearing things such as, quote, non-Jews are like the other woman in the situation. God has his bride, and he loves Israel, and he's using the other woman to make his bride jealous. No, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Or the Jews are the people of Israel, the Jews are his people. At best, non-Jews are grafted in. At best, no, sir. We're heirs.
Yeah.
So
co-equal in the kingdom. So I'm willing to admit that I would say your question really rings true in the sense that I don't want to paint with a wide brush. I don't want to put a blanket on it. I just think that
getting past that identity crisis, and in some cases, identity idolatry, becoming idolatry situation, I think would help the movement move forward. But I wanted to add, Jonathan, you're a non-Jew that's a rabbi, just like I am, which I think is an amazing testimony to the one new man. It's how did you go through that or work through that, if you did at all?
Yeah, I don't think it's an imposed, and there are some places that we know of, but I think it's more sometimes a wording thing. So, for example, a lot of Messianic leadership that I've talked to outside of Chayim, Brit, a lot of congregations around us, sometimes the first things I'll hear is that, well, we don't expect Gentiles to keep the Torah. We know, and I'm like, well, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Because, there's a lot in the Torah that is, should be kept. And, Rabbi Eric's blog this last week kind of touched on that, between, what's the difference between Shabbat and adultery? Or how are they similar? Well, both are required by God. God commands both to be kept in the same list of commands, and they're not, he doesn't give a dividing line. So sometimes it's just wording. I think that, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean you don't expect me to keep, Shabbat? Do you not expect a Gentile to keep kosher? Do you not expect, if you invite Gentiles into your, like here we have oneg, where people bring food to the synagogue. Right. We tell everyone, and at the synagogue, it has to be a kosher meat. It has to be a kosher meal. So you can't bring pork or shrimp, and this is Florida. So like if we have access to all that, but everyone, Gentiles included, have to bring a kosher food to the synagogue. So that's like, okay, so
same regulations apply.
Same regulations apply across the board. If we're going to walk in 14. Unity, the halacha needs to be the same for both Jews and Gentiles within the Messianic congregation. And now, what you do at home is between you and God. Like that's kind of the beauty of.
Yeah, we don't have kosher police that.
Or Shabbat police or
breaking
it.
Sorry. I was going to continue that. And I think this is the beauty. And if we could jump in Acts 10, this is the beauty of Acts. What we see Cornelius in Acts 10 is Cornelius. This is between him and God. His decision to, and we see. I love that they mention the hour of prayer Cornelius is praying, or when the vision comes, and then the very next section of this chapter it mentions Peter during the hour of prayer. So there's this connection to Cornelius and. And what's great about the hours of prayer is prayer. We see prayer, commanded. It's an act of the service of the heart in Torah.
Yes,
but it's also a tradition. It's also not just Torah, but it goes with Judaism as a tradition. So
and there's a reason in the tradition for like a tie-in biblically, a reason in the tradition, because a lot of times you brought up it's tradition to do this. A lot of times people are going, oh, but Jewish tradition, it's just tradition. It's not, and people like to say that, Jews look at tradition and Talmud and what have you as being equal to the Torah. Well, no, but these traditions tie us to the intent. So like, the tradition of the prayer times, like it's specifying what prayer time, so we know whether it was morning, afternoon, evening, we know exactly what was going on when, and those times of prayer in Judaism every day are connected to the temple services that took place at that time of day, so that, and that was developed so that if a time came again, as it did in 70 CE when the temple was gone, we still could have that sacrificial heart in approaching the throne.
Right, which is why Daniel prays 3 times a day facing Jerusalem at the hours of prayer.
And so since you segued to Acts 10, which it was a beautiful segue, I want to just take a quick moment. Like, we can't read the whole chapter. I mean, we could, but it would take a few minutes. But I want to read a split second of it, and then I want us to really dive into this, because this is one of my favorite discussions to have when we're dealing with the idea of Jew and Gentile, especially here on the Gulf Coast, where, like you said, pork is everywhere, and shellfish is everywhere, and catfish is everywhere. So this is a fun conversation, right? So Acts 10, we're going to read verses 9 through 14, and that's it. We'll paraphrase everything else. If you're listening in your car,
pull over.
Wait till you get home and pull your Bible or something. Yeah, if you're listening at home, pull out your Bible and you can read with us. But I want to point this out, because this is a big part of the conversation, is biblical interpretation without accurate context is what causes 99.97% of our theological issues in the body of Messiah.
And all statistics are made up on the spot.
Exactly. I just made that up right then and there. So Acts 10 verse 9 says, The next day, as the soldiers were traveling and approaching the city, Peter went up to the rooftop to pray at about the 6th hour. Now, he became very hungry and wanted to eat. But while they were preparing something, he fell into a trance. He saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet coming down, lowered by its 4 corners to the earth. In it were all sorts of 4-footed animals and reptiles and birds of the air. A voice came to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "Certainly not, Lord, for never have I eaten anything unholy or unclean." Now, this back and forth between the Lord and Peter in this vision, it says that they had this back and forth 3 times. Peter, get up, kill and eat. No, I've never put anything unclean in my mouth. Peter, get up, kill and eat. No, I've never put anything unclean in my mouth. Peter, kill, get up and eat. I've never put anything unclean in my mouth. And the next thing it says is the sheet disappeared, right? I don't know about you guys, but I've tried really hard a lot of times in my life to argue with God, and to date, I've never won. Have you guys?
No. Because often what I'll tell people is if you have to have an argument even with yourself more than twice, you know the answer. It's just you don't want to.
Right. And it would appear if we were to read this text as most of the body of Messiah does, which is to read it to say this is about food, hear God saying you can eat whatever you want. If that were really the intent and the purpose of this passage, would Peter have won this argument? I mean, I kind of get this feeling that if God really wanted him to eat it, at some point God would have held him down and shoved the pork chop down his throat or something. Mm-hmm. But we realize that if you look at it in context, again, I said the context of the passage is so important. This is in the middle of Acts 10, right? So there's stuff that's happening early in Acts 10 and stuff that's happening late in Acts 10. And if you pay attention to them both the beginning and the ending of Acts 10 are dealing with Cornelius, this centurion, who is a God-fearer. In other words, as Rabbi Eric said earlier, you have 4 types of people that are being dealt with in the Brit Chadashah. You have Jews who are non-believers, Jews who are believers, Gentiles who are non-believers, and Gentiles who are believers. But within that are also other subcategories, such as the fact that you had 3 types of Gentiles in the relationship with Judaism and Israel, right? You had those of the nations who had nothing to do with Judaism. They were just considered the nations, right? They were just out there. Then you had your God-fearers, which is how we often translate it from the Brit Chadashah. You had your God-fearers, who were people that believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as best they could. They lived out a relationship with the Word of God, like Cornelius, but they were not converted to Judaism. So they weren't able to enter the temple in its fullness. They weren't able to participate in the fullness of Jewish life as the Jewish people did. And then you had those that were proselytes who were of the nation but had fully converted to Judaism. And so here Cornelius was a God-fearer. This means that he was a man of the nations who believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, and had an affection for him, had a love and a passion, a worship for him, but had not converted to Judaism. And so we see that he has this random dream, and God says, "Hey, I want you to go get this dude named Peter, and I want you to bring Peter back to your house," right? And he goes, "Okay, great." And he sends his men out for him. But God also knows the heart of Peter. Peter doesn't like Gentiles. If you read the Gospels, Peter was not a fan of Gentiles. Wasn't his favorite people in the world. As a matter of fact, it created some rift between him and Paul later on because he kind of backtracked on this some. Whenever some of James' boys would come around, he'd kind of backtrack a little bit and separate himself from the Gentiles. Right. And so when we look at this, you've got Cornelius being told, "I got to go get this dude named Peter. Peter don't like you, but go get him anyways." And then Peter's sitting there, no clue what's going on, but God's already got messengers coming to get him. And so now he's got to get Peter's attention because he has this vision, the sheet disappears, and immediately after the sheet disappears, what happens?
Cornelius shows up.
"Hey, is there a dude named Peter here? Because our boss told us to come get you."
It's also important to note that while Cornelius is a non-Jewish person who has a relationship with the God of Israel, he does not yet, at the beginning of this text, have a relationship with the Messiah of Israel.
Correct.
But he knew of the teachings of the coming of Messiah.
Correct. Because of his relationship with Jewish tradition, Jewish scriptures, and so on. And so the very next thing after the sheet disappears is there's a knock at the door, and the text tells us that when this encounter occurs and he goes to Cornelius' house, because the next thing that happens is they knock at the door. Hey, is there a dude named Peter here? Yeah, Peter's here. And Peter comes down. Hey, our boss Cornelius told us to come get you and to bring him back. And Peter goes, oh, okay. And he gets up and he goes. And he goes and he sees the power of God fall on Cornelius' household, which, by the way, is a mirror narrative to what we see in Acts 2 in Jerusalem with the Jewish community when the Spirit of God fell in Acts 2 on Shavuot, or what's called Pensacola in the church. And so he sees the Spirit of God fall on them as they come to faith in Messiah, and he goes, oh, now I get it. When God said, don't call anything I made clean unclean, he wasn't talking about food. Peter never went and started eating ham sandwiches. Instead, Peter realized, oh, God's talking about the nations. The nations are now being brought into this faithfulness, this fruitfulness of the kingdom of Messiah. This is exciting. This is awesome. But if you ignore Cornelius at the beginning and Cornelius at the end, and you take Peter's vision in Acts 2 out of context, you can make it say whatever you want. But you're still wrong. It's got nothing to do with food. If it did, he would have eaten.
Right. It actually says twice, and Peter was trying to figure out what this means. And then it says, now God has revealed to me that what he has made clean, call not unclean, talking about Gentiles. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people don't realize that this event that happens with Peter and the sheet is not the first time God speaks to somebody in the Bible and tells him to eat something unclean. In Ezekiel chapter 4, he speaks to the prophet and says, I want you to cook something on human dung and eat it. Now, the prophet doesn't eat it then either. So this isn't a matter of...
And he argues about it, too.
Right. And
he says the same thing. I've never put anything unclean in my mouth.
Right. So this is not the first time this has happened. So Peter would have been aware of Ezekiel and this conversation going on. So when we put it in the full context, it makes it a little clearer.
Yep. And so we talk about that because it's important to understand, like, the idea of and this is one of the things Rabbi Zaki Shapira, this is one of my favorite things that he talks about so much, is the difference between we have this notion of Jew and Gentile, right? But Zaki is really big on talking about the idea of a Ger Tzedek, of a righteous one of the nations, who isn't just Joe Schmo from down the street that wandered in the synagogue one day to visit just to experience it, never showed up again, right? No, this is somebody, and then left a bad Google review because they were speaking some weird language he didn't understand. But this is somebody who has attached themselves through the Messiah of Israel to the people of Israel, which is what Romans tells us happened. Paul talks about the olive tree. And he says that the natural branches were cut off for lack of belief to make room for you, the unnatural branches, to be grafted in with the olive tree, with the root and the fatness of the olive tree. And then he says, but don't become arrogant, which is ultimately what I think occurred in the 3rd and 4th century, as the body of Messiah, now predominantly Gentile, pushed the Jews away. He says, don't become arrogant in your place on the tree, because as easy as it was for God to cut off the natural branches, how much easier is it going to be to cut off the unnatural branches if you become arrogant, right? And I think going back to what we were talking earlier about sometimes the Gentiles in the movement feeling kind of second class, I think there is some degree of imposition in that discussion where we as Jewish believers have put some doubt in there, some anguish in there. And part of that, again, just as I said, that sometimes from the Gentile side, there's this identity crisis. Messianic Jews have a bit of an identity crisis too. We talked about it a little bit in the first episode. And the reality is that one particular organization of Messianic Judaism or the Messianic Jewish congregations operates the way it does because, in my estimation, I'm not saying this is like in the bylaws, this is my estimation, that we're afraid if there is this influx and overflow of the Gentiles having control or say or activity in the direction of the movement, we're afraid that somehow they're just going to ruin it all over again, and they're going to make it like what happened with the Roman Catholic Church in the 3rd and 4th century and where it's become now. And so there's this fear that if Gentiles get too much control, it's just going to be like last time, we're going to lose this. But we either believe that this is an end-time revival movement, this is an end-time restoration of Israel through the promised Messiah of Israel, in which Jew and Gentile are being made new as one in what God intended for his bride to be to begin with, or we don't. And the only way we can truly have fear that we're going to lose what Messianic Judaism is supposed to be just because the people God is calling in who are not Jewish are coming in is if we don't truly believe that this is what we've always said it is.
Right. And the end of the story in Acts 10, it says that how can we forbid water that these should not be immersed who have received the Spirit the same way we have? And so it's Jewish people identifying that these non-Jewish people received the same experience that they did. And so if the experience is the same, then the result should be the same.
Yep.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have some time to go into the next part, because it may, what came to my mind was something Jonathan said earlier, which was when someone told him, well, we don't expect Gentiles not to keep the Torah. Well, one of the things that I've heard
to keep the Torah
is, or we don't expect them to. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. One of the things I've heard is, well, here, I've actually heard I heard a Jewish believer say to me, well, here's the problem. If all non-Jews in the movement were keeping the Torah, how would we be able to differentiate and know who's Jewish and who isn't? Well, that doesn't hold water to me for a lot of reasons, but one of them is, well, think about Elijah when he said, I'm the only one left. And God said to Elijah, he goes, I have preserved 7,000 in Israel whose knees have not bowed. God knows who his remnant of his firstborn of his chosen people, Israel, is. He knows who they are. And to think, that's putting God in a box to say that, well, if all the look, if the whole world was following the Torah, it would be a great world community. I'm just saying, I just think it's really, really, it's wrong, and I don't think it's the heart of God at all to tell someone you can only go this far with God, and I think the whole purpose of the plan of redemption and Yeshua's return is to teach the world God's ways. Yeshua's not going to come back, I don't think, and say, well, I only want the people of Israel doing the Torah. Yeah. So it doesn't hold water to me for someone to say, and that leads into the Jerusalem Council, which is the same. And what we're talking about now is
same thing they were debating.
The same thing they were debating.
Yeah. And like you said, the reality is, and we talked about this last week. The reality is that there are distinctions between Jew and Gentile, male and female.
Calling.
There are distinctions. There are distinctions between the rabbi and the congregation. There are distinctions between all of these different things. Distinctions aren't bad.
No.
Right? The beauty is those distinctions coming together as one body.
Right. Nobody says if we start allowing our women to keep the Shabbat, we'll no longer be able to determine who's men. And we never say, if we allow our women to start keeping kosher, we won't be able to determine who's men.
Right.
How does it flow for Gentiles?
For me, it becomes a problem when it's, well, we're not going to let Gentile boys get bar mitzvahed. Or Gentile girls get bat mitzvahed.
Yeah.
Or
have special names for it.
I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which is not weird. The heart of God. It's not the heart of God.
And those are things that I think do impose that second class feeling.
Or my Jewish son will not marry a non-Jewish girl.
Yeah.
Especially thousands of years on the other side of the cross.
Yeah.
There is no room for it.
And more so when so many, and I don't mean this to come across as like incendiary, but when so many Messianic rabbis are married to non-Jewish women.
It's unbelievable.
And I mean, it's just funny that sometimes we kind of get up in arms about things. But leading into Acts 15, which is the very discussion of what should Gentiles do or not do, what should Jews do or not do, what have you. Here you've got Paul again. We're going to read a short passage or segment of it, but we're going to kind of paraphrase and deal with the whole chapter. But again, you've got Paul and Barnabas now in Jerusalem. They've come and met with the other Talmudim, the other disciples that are there. And the Jerusalem body of Messiah is being led by Yaakov or Jacob,
the big three, right?
Yeah, King Jimmy's good buddy, James, the apostle, but his actual name in Hebrew is Yaakov or Jacob in English, and so this is the brother of Yeshua or half brother. People like to notate that.
I call the
brother
big
of Yeshua.
James, John, and Peter. Yaakov, John, and Peter. I call them the big three.
Yeah. And so you've got Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, who's the leader of the body of Messiah in Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas come to the disciples in Jerusalem. They meet with them, like, dude, listen, you got to hear this. Like, let me tell you what God is doing among the nations. Like,
I'd love to have seen that.
Because the thing is people don't realize this, right? But this is one of the most important concepts in the Jewish mind about the Messiah, and I'm gonna brag about you, Rabbi Eric, who I know as dad, so it's just weird saying Rabbi Eric, but I'm gonna brag about Rabbi Eric and Brit for a second. Is one of the things that I talk about a lot. In how we should yearn for Messianic Judaism to be viewed and our congregation to be viewed is Rabbi Eric here at Brit. They've actually had people from the traditional synagogues here in town in the Pensacola area who have been to their services, in High Holy Day services and Shabbat services and what have you, that have come, and he's heard at least from one, and I think from several people, say something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, but something along the lines of, Brit is the last remaining true expression of Judaism in Pensacola. And he says, well, what do you mean? How do you figure that? I mean, you've got these other congregations.
Let me correct. What they said was, if things keep going the way they are, Brit will be the only lasting Jewish expression in Pensacola.
Okay.
That's because the other congregations have been dwindling so much.
And when he said, well, what do you mean by that? The response was, because Judaism has always believed that when the Messiah comes, the nations will be drawn through him to Torah. And here is the only place. It doesn't happen in the other synagogues in the same way. He said, here is the only place where Jew and Gentile alike are brought in and connected through the Messiah, through who you believe to be the Messiah, to the Torah. And so one of the premises in the Jewish mind, and it's a scriptural reality, one of the premises in the Jewish mind of the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, is that he will awaken the nation to the Torah. Again, distinctions. There's certain things that necessarily aren't, that they're not necessarily for Gentiles that they can interact with, but understanding that it doesn't make them Jewish, interact with it, and all of that. And we've already covered the distinctions things, but nonetheless, this is a very important mindset. So when the body of Messiah and when Messianic rabbis say, well, Gentiles don't have to do that because that's not our thing, that's the Jewish thing, right? We're actually pushing Jews away from the Torah, because we're pushing Jews away from Messiah, because they believe if the Messiah came, the nations would have a yearning for Torah.
Yeah, Israel was supposed to be the bug light to the nations.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, it was supposed to be a light that drew people to God.
Yes.
And gave them a desire for the God of Israel. Now, we say the God of Israel all the time, but he's never just been the God of Israel.
Yeah.
But that was
Israel also has never been just the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob either.
Right. So it's one of those things where if we're doing our job as Jewish believers, then it should attract non-Jewish people. But when you attract non-Jewish people, you don't attract them just so you can say, well, it's nice that you drop by. There has to be a place they can. Yeah,
I'm gonna go. Yeah, right. Don't forget the tzedakah box on your way out. We want your money, but we don't want you.
It's amazing that does happen. That is what happens.
Yes, but I want
occasionally.
I'm gonna throw a hand grenade out there, because I've been sitting on this one since we started this podcast. But I'm gonna throw a hand grenade out there, and I think each of you have heard me talk about this before, and I know that quite a few people that are listening that know me personally.
My flat vest on real quick.
Right. It's gonna get rough. I have a theory, and we can debate over it, we can argue over it. This is my theory. I have a theory that a Messianic Jewish synagogue, and what it's called to be, right? In Messianic Jewish synagogue, we are as a congregation, our primary hope and our primary yearning is to reach our Jewish people with the message of Messiah, right? But I don't believe that a Messianic Jewish synagogue can be effective in its calling if it is not primarily Gentile. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be Jews in the congregation, but there's a prophecy in Zechariah that says in the end that there will be 10 of those of the nations that grab a hold of the corner or the tzitzit of a Jew and say, I want you to take me to your God. Now, 10 to 1 minimum is my thought. Minimum. There should be 10 Gentiles for every single Jew that comes into the congregation, coming to faith or leaving a church and coming in, whatever. For every Jew that comes into the congregation, there should be 10 Gentiles coming in. And potentially 40 to 1 because we wear 4 tzitzit, but that's a whole different discussion. But if that's the case, and when you look at the callings of the Jewish people and the callings of the nations, both the Jewish people before Messiah came and Jews in Messiah and the nations in Messiah, there's a cyclical reality, as everything in Judaism is. There's a cyclical reality to the callings of both. The Jewish people are called not to reach the Jewish people. The Jewish people are called to be a light to the nations. We're called to bring the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the nations. And the nations, Paul says in Romans, are brought into the body of Messiah to drive the Jew to jealousy for his God. Not in the sense like you talked earlier that you've heard Messianic rabbis say, oh, it's just the other woman, it's the adulteress, and no, that's not what he means by drive them to jealousy. He means that the nation should in Messiah should live their lives in such a deep, intimate relationship with God that the Jewish people look at him and go, they know my God better than I know my God. I want to go know more about what they're doing, right? And at a Messianic synagogue, we actually see this, or should actually see this play out, right? There should be Jews being reached by the congregation, not because there are Jews in the congregation that only care about Jews, but because there are people of the nations in the congregation who have a yearning to fulfill their calling to reach the Jewish people with the message of Messiah. And likewise, as a Jewish believer, we should be reaching the nations with the promised Jewish Messiah and working together to reach the Jewish people as a whole.
And that verse in Zechariah 8 that you quoted or paraphrased, it says, "Thus saith Adonai Tsevaot, the Lord of hosts, in those days it will come to pass that 10 men from every language of the nations will grasp the corner of the garment
to one."
of Jews, saying, "Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." So it's not just, I'm grabbing onto this, but I want to go with you. Now, you have to become a part of what you're doing. Walk alongside you as you're doing it.
And what's interesting is that we see some imagery of that in Yeshua. You've got the woman with the issue of blood that grabs hold of the seat. She knew there was power in grabbing a hold of the seat. But that wasn't the only time. There's another place where it talks about there were crowds that were gathering around him and just reaching, hoping they could just grab his seat and experience his power. And some of those, it says, were of the nations. So there's already this notion there, right? And so when we talk about the distinctions between Jew and Gentile, there are distinctions there, but it's not to drive us apart. It's to better meld us together for a unique purpose of reaching the world with the message of the promised Jewish Messiah who came for all. And so when we talk about Acts 15, right, you've got Paul and Barnabas showing up in Jerusalem, and they go, dude, we got to tell you, you got to hear this story. Let me tell you what God's doing in the nations. You're never going to believe it. And they're going, oh, no, we believe it, because this is exactly what we've been expecting from the Messiah, is that the nations would be reached and brought in and all of this. And so they go through this whole discussion. There's this banter back and forth with, those that are very much still rooted in Pharisaic Judaism, which wasn't a problem. It wasn't a bad thing. Yeshua didn't hate Pharisees. Yeshua actually, for all intents and purposes, would have better categorized as a Pharisee than anything else.
Pharisee isn't a word that means hypocrite.
Yeah.
There were Pharisees who were hypocrites, but Pharisees,
just
the Scripture goes on to say,
and the
Pharisees, the Scripture says, and the Pharisees which believe. They didn't stop being Pharisees when they became believers.
Yeah. And so you've got these two different groups, and they're going, okay, well, great, they're coming to faith in Yeshua, so they need to go get circumcised and become Jews. And then you've got the other side going, it's a little far. I don't think that's really what we're supposed to do here, right? And so when we're reading, we see in Acts 15, there's this debate back and forth, and they're talking, and verse 9 says, "He made no distinction between us and them," speaking of Jews and Gentiles, "purifying their hearts through faith." In other words, the same way that it did us. "Why then do you put God to the test by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear?" And he's not talking about the Torah, right? Not to the sense of whether or not we should be living it out. The next verse tells us what they're really talking about, and that's, what are we living it out for, right? The next verse, verse 11 says, "But instead, we believe that we are saved through grace of the Lord Yeshua in the same way as they are." So he's talking right out the gate, we as Jewish people are saved the same way the nations are, right? So there shouldn't be this big distinction of how we live that out. So then they go a little farther, and we see Jacob, James begins to expound upon this, and he says, look, here's the thing with these Gentiles that are coming in, right? He says, verse 19, "Therefore I judge not to trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but to write to them to abstain from the contamination of idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what is strangled, and from blood. For Moses from ancient generations has had in every city those who proclaim him, since he is read in all the synagogues every Shabbat. So first and foremost, he says, here's the 4 things that I think Gentiles need to focus on right now, right? Here's the 4 things. All 4 of them are extremely, arbitrary. Notice, if this is, as most would say, as most in the body would say, that this is all Gentiles have to worry about, right? If that's the case, dude, Gentiles got it easy. They can murder whoever they want, because that's not one of those 4 things.
Yeah, I actually told somebody one time that if you because they told me Gentiles only have to do these 4 things, I said, well, that's terrific, except we can't ask Gentiles to give offerings or tithe anymore. However, we can enlist the Gentiles to collect tithe and offering for us, because then when the Jewish people come, we can send the Gentiles to go mug them.
Right,
and get all of their money, because stealing and robbery are not something they're prohibited from.
But what's interesting with these 4 things is, again, context is everything, right? We historical context is what we're dealing with here now, not just the context of the passage, but historical context. These 4 issues are extremely arbitrary. All of the Aseret HaDibrot are not considered in this. The 10 words are not part of this, and so on, including you shall have no other God before me. Not one of these 4 issues, right? He says, so you should abstain from contamination of idols, from sexual immorality, from what is strangled, and from blood. Now, these are important because 3 of them are actually kashrut laws. 3 of them dealing with keeping kosher. But beyond that, there's a reason for these 4 specific issues. What are those of the nations in the first century coming into the body Messiah from?
Paganism.
From paganism. That's it. You had Jews, you had pagans. There were no other options.
The Roman pantheon.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they're coming in from a worship structure in which sleeping with temple prostitutes was common practice as part of your worship, in which eating foods offered to idols was part of worship, in which eating foods that still had the blood in it was part of worship, drinking blood was part of worship, and so on. These are all issues that were part of pagan worship in the first century and even before that. Habits. And so they're saying, look, you're entering a new worship structure. And none of that stuff's going to work. It doesn't matter whether or not you eat a ham sandwich or not. If you're still, sleeping with temple prostitutes, that ham sandwich is a moot point.
You can't go in a synagogue and look for a woman.
It's kind of like if an alcoholic comes to faith, right? What's the first thing God's got to deal with in their life? Their alcoholism, right? And that's what this is God's, or the disciples are saying, James in particular is saying, look, let's not put all the rest of it, like whether or not they're walking a Shabbat day's journey or not. Let's not bother with that discussion right now. Let's deal with the issues that really matter in the moment, that are important.
And it's interesting, before we go on, that I have been all over the country and parts of the world, and I've never heard a traditional Christian pastor teach that their followers needed to keep these commandments, these 4. Now, we're going to go on in a minute and talk further, but that the 4, abstaining from foods offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and fornication. Now, they will talk about fornication, but I've never heard a pastor preach to his congregation that the disciples taught that all Gentiles were obligated to not eat blood, not eat food strangled, and not eat foods offered to idols. I've never heard that taught in a church. So if we're...
But I have heard a lot taught about what from the rest of the Torah they shouldn't do.
Right. But those 4, these 4 things are incumbent. There's no question they're incumbent upon all non-Jewish people.
Yeah.
So now let's delve into the next verse.
Yeah. And so the very next verse, verse 21, says, For Moses from ancient generations has had in every city those who proclaim him, since he is read in all the synagogues every Shabbat. So that means that there's 2 other assumptions being made here, right? There's 4 things that they're saying you got to focus on these, but there's 2 other assumptions. What's the first?
Well, they're hearing the Torah.
That they're going to hear the Torah, and when?
Synagogues, on Shabbat.
On Shabbat. So it's assumed that these of the nations are going to come in and they're going to be going to the synagogue. So they're going to be keeping Shabbat in some way or another. They're going to kind of be keeping Shabbat and going to synagogue, and they're going to be hearing the Torah service. They're going to hear the Torah read, because the Torah cycle was established 300 to 500 years before this period of time, when the disciples are standing in Jerusalem having this conversation. So they're, and you got to remember, what we know as the church is 200 years from occurring yet. Right? Best case, 150 years. But it hasn't happened yet. All they're doing is coming into Messianic, or what we would look at today as Messianic synagogues. And at this point, pre the destruction of the temple, they actually were still just going to regular synagogues, traditional synagogues. And then farther out, you had other communities that developed, but they were doing the same thing. So it's assumed they're going to... Now, there are those that will debate, oh, well, that's not enough proof that they're keeping Shabbat, or that was the assumption just because they said one thing. I heard, as a matter of fact, the same people that said that, well, how are we going to know if everybody's keeping kosher? How are we going to know which ones are Jews and which ones are Gentiles? They're the same ones that we heard at that same time make the statement that, well, this isn't saying that they're going to be keeping Shabbat and hearing the Torah cycle. It's just saying that that's been around forever and it never impacted the Gentiles, so why would it impact them now?
I think it's funny that people will say that because, the very previous thing is talking about if you go up to, Gentile Joe Schmo, Roman legionary who's come in to your synagogue and has been born again and desires to walk with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you tell him, all right, man, you got to let go of the idols. Well, how do you explain idols? Like, what are idols? Like, what is idolatry? How do you learn about idolatry? How does God describe idolatry? Where do you go for that?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Torah. Yeah. What is sexual morality? What is sexual morality? Yeah. How do you define it? The Torah.
Wow. Yeah.
So you kind of have to learn the Torah in order to do just those four things.
And you bring up a really important point.
Wow.
At this point in time, what we know is the Brit Hadashah didn't exist yet. Yeah. There were a few random letters scattered around, but it didn't exist yet. In 1 Timothy, when Paul says all Scripture is good for reproof and da-da-da, what Scripture is he talking about? Because what we know is the Brit Hadashah didn't exist yet.
Yeah.
He's talking about the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or what the body calls the Old Testament. It didn't exist. The Brit Hadashah didn't exist. So the only Scripture there is to go to, like you're saying, Jonathan, to learn this stuff at that point in time is the Torah.
Yeah, that's why that was that argument we heard was so weak.
Yeah. Right, and the next thing that people will say when they want to discount the involvement of non-Jewish people in coming to Shabbat and listening to the Torah, Moses being taught, is they say, well, when they actually sent the letter out, they didn't include that verse. They just included the other. Yeah.
Which, and we'll say this to close out because our time's about up for the day. But it's interesting. I've heard people say that. Well, if there was more, they would have said more. They would. But the reality is if all there was those four things, and that was all they were trying to express, then yes, they would have never said, for the Torah is read in Shabbat every week. And two, they never would have needed to send other men with the message. And it says that they went to tell them everything else that was taught. They would have never needed to say that. They could have just sent the letter. If all that was needed was a letter, send a letter out, let them read it. It'll be all right, right? Never needed to add any of the rest of it.
I was just a very interesting historical point that, this commandment has to do with, not drinking blood and not eating things that are strangled. Where are you going to find that in the ancient world? Where are you going to find meat? Yeah. Kosher butcher.
Yeah.
You're gonna, a Jewish person who's killing animals.
Right.
We have historical record of Christian communities on into the 15th and 16th century in like France, who ate only kosher meat to keep this edict given from the Jerusalem
and the Russian
Council.
Orthodox Church kept Shabbat all the way up until I think it's the 600s or 900s, I forget. But so there are parts of the Christian Church who continued to keep Saturday Sabbath, even opposed to the Roman Catholic and the Universal Church changing way up hundreds and hundreds of years later.
Yeah. So, like I said at the beginning, I don't think we're ever going to finish this conversation. It's always a great one. We'll come back around, as Rabbi Eric said earlier. We're going to circle back. We'll come back around to it again because this is a very pervasive issue in the Messianic Jewish movement, and I think in the body of Messiah as a whole, and very important. Not that we necessarily find our way to the end of the conversation, but that we actually wrestle with this debate and find a common ground where all in the body are welcome.
Yeah, and Rabbi David said something really important earlier that I want to kind of throw in at the end here, and that's that when they talked about them being saved or them being redeemed, they were redeemed not by observance of Torah, not by following a list of rules, not by following what Moses said in the way, but through grace. So none of us are saying that Jew or non-Jew are redeemed by obedience to Torah. Our lifestyle is the response to our redemption, not the way we receive redemption.
Exactly. And salvation, when we talk about keeping Torah, I don't keep Shabbat because it's earning me brownie points in heaven. Not at all.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I worked in restaurants for 16 years. I lost a ton of money not working Friday nights and Saturdays. Right? I mean, a ton of money. And,
you did.
And if it really wasn't all that important to me and I didn't think it was all that important to God, I would have just milked all that money for all I could. But it was, and I truly feel that for the Messianic community, it is vital that we come to a reality and an understanding that there is a place for Jew and Gentile, one in the Messiah, one in the fullness of the Word of God, as a guide for our lives. That doesn't mean that every single word and every single commandment is meant for every single person. But that also doesn't, I hear the term a lot, and we'll cover this in the next episode. I hear the term a lot, one law. You got to be careful of those one law people. The problem is it's terrible nomenclature. There is only one law. Not all of it is for but there is one law. That's all there is. And we sound stupid when we keep throwing these terrible words around that have nothing to do with what we actually mean.
Which we are going to get into in our next episode.
And my final very quick thought is just simply, as leaders in the Messianic movement, us four sitting here and anyone who's listening, as we move forward in our callings and as this movement moves forward, when we look at the distinctions between Jew and non-Jew within the movement, we have to be careful how we traverse those and how we handle those, because we need to understand one thing while we're moving through those distinctions and working through those distinctions, which there are between Jew and non-Jew. There is no difference between our status before God, our sonship and our daughtership, whether you're Jew or non-Jew. The same blood covers, and the love of God is equally distributed.
Yep. And with that said, if in the Messianic community we spent more time making room within a healthy, authentic Messianic Jewish movement for Jew and non-Jew to be as one, we'd have a lot less issues with some of the things we're going to deal with in the next episode, because they would be, Jew and Gentile alike would be learning how to live their distinctive role within a healthy Messianic Jewish context, rather than feeling pushed away from it and finding their acceptance and such elsewhere.
And as we close out this episode, remember, if you have a comment or a question or a topic you'd like for us to talk about in an upcoming episode, you can comment on our Facebook page, MessianTics Podcast.
And we'll see you guys next week. Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.